have a very special guest who wasn't on our schedule until a couple of weeks ago, and that's Mr. Padraic Benson from the U.S. Department of Energy Legacy Management Office. And I don't know, he's an analyst, but he's the unofficial historian or the official historian of AEC DOE technology. And so we were very lucky to have him give an overview of the atomic weapons program from the Manhattan Project through legacy management oversight. And with no further introduction, Padraic.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me on the mic well enough? All right. Well, thank you all for coming out on this rainy evening. I appreciate it. So I'm a program analyst, but I am the historian, unofficial historian for LM. And I should ask, show of hands, how many of you all are familiar with the Office of Legacy Management? So just about everyone. All right, so I thought I'd start by telling you stuff you're already familiar with. But LM's mission is to fulfill the Department of Energy's post-closure responsibilities and ensure the future protection of human health and the environment. So basically, we look after sites after they've been cleaned up, no longer have an operational mission, and we make sure that the remedies hold. So places like Mound here. And real quick, before I get started with the official talk, let me just run through the different authorities and programs that we organize our office around. So we have UMTRCA sites, that's Uranium Mill Tailings Radiation Control Act, that came out in 1978. Title I addressed uranium mill tailings from mills that were no longer in operation in '78. And Title II addresses mills that were still operational in '78. We have CERCLA-RCRA sites, like Mound here. That's the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act. A lot of people call that Superfund. FUSRAP, that's my favorite one to say. That stands for Formally Utilized Sites Remedial Action Program, which is a mouthful. And they come in about three different varieties, you could say. There's completed sites. Those are sites that have been cleaned up already. There's active sites. Those are sites that are currently undergoing remediation by the U.S. Army Corps. And then there's a whole lot of sites that were considered for the program, but for various reasons were eliminated. They didn't need to be addressed by the program. And FUSRAP in particular addresses a lot of privately owned sites that supported the Manhattan Project and early Atomic Energy Commission. Then we also have D&D sites, decontamination and decommissioning. And this kind of grew out of a parallel to FUSRAP, a program that was designed to address surplus facilities that were government-owned, but needed cleaning up and then release. And a lot of these sites for LM are small demonstration reactors. Then we have Nevada offsites. Those are sites that did nuclear testing off the Nevada test site. All right, finally, the actual talk. From the Manhattan Project to legacy management. Or why does legacy management have so many sites? As you can see in this map, we've got, I think as of today, 94 sites spread all across the country from Alaska all the way to Puerto Rico. And the short answer is we have so many sites because the race for the atomic bomb during World War II and the arms race and early atomic energy programs during the Cold War involved hundreds of sites across the United States. With the subsequent emergence of new national priorities, the U.S. Department of Energy has taken on increased responsibilities for the protection of human health and the environment at many of these sites. So part one, World War II and the race for the bomb. We'll start with December 7th, 1941. What happened on that day? Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States officially into the Second World War. And about 2 weeks later, these group of men came together, known as the S-1 Committee, and they were tasked with investigating the possibility of an atomic weapon. The guys over here looked into uranium, enriched uranium as a fuel for an atomic bomb. Harold Urey, he looked into gaseous diffusion and thermal diffusion. Ernest Lawrence, he looked into electromagnetic separation. But we're not going to talk about these guys or the enrichment process. We're going to focus on Arthur Compton. Anybody know why we're going to focus on Compton? Because he's from Ohio. Born and raised, went to College of Wooster. And rather than looking at enriched uranium, he was tasked with looking into plutonium as fuel for an atomic weapon. And he set up he left this meeting and set up an ambitious schedule to create enough plutonium for a nuclear weapon within about 3 years. And this was pretty ambitious because at the time, it was only theoretically possible to produce enough plutonium for a weapon. To produce a plutonium, you needed a reactor, which was theoretically possible. And to get a reactor to work, you needed enough pure uranium metal that was in short supply to act as fuel. And to get more metal, you needed uranium ore, which again was in uncertain supply. But at the time, he was working at the University of Chicago, so he brought together a team there to work on the problem, and they became known as the Metallurgical Laboratory, or METLab for short. And they found the perfect place to build their test reactor under the college football stadium at the University of Chicago Stagg Field. And they called the reactor Chicago Pile 1 because basically it was just a pile of graphite blocks, uranium metal, and uranium oxide. So it was truly a pile. But by December 2nd, 1942, it went critical in the first self-sustained nuclear reaction. Now, once they knew that the reactor could work, they decided they should move it out to a safer location outside of the city of Chicago. So they moved to a place called Site A. And there they rebuilt the reactor and called it Chicago Pile 2. Now, one of the men involved in moving the reactor from the university out to Site A was this man, Second Lieutenant Philip Leahy. Now, while he was in the middle of all that work, he got orders from his commanding officer to go out west and find domestic sources of uranium for the bomb project. Because at this time, most of the uranium ore had come from the Belgian Congo in Africa or Canada. So they wanted to find domestic sources. So he came out west and he worked with the Vanadium Corporation of America and one of their mills at Monticello, Utah, to get some uranium concentrates. He worked with Vanadium Corporation of America at Natarita as well. And they sent their concentrates all the way across the country to Cannonsburg, Pennsylvania, for further refinement into a material called soda salt. Now, Leahy also worked with U.S. Vanadium Corporation in Durango, Colorado, and also at 2 plants in Uravan, Colorado, to produce concentrates called green sludge. And the green sludge, in turn, was sent to a U.S. Vanadium-operated refinery in Grand Junction, Colorado. where it was turned into yellow sludge, what today we call yellow cake. Now, from Grand Junction, the yellow sludge went up to Linde Air Products in Tonawanda, New York, where it went through a series of steps. The yellow sludge went to black oxide, then to brown oxide, and then finally to green salt. And similar processes were happening at places like El Dorado Refinery up in Ontario, Canada. Not one of our sites because it's Canadian. Mallinckrodt Chemical Works out in St. Louis, Missouri. DuPont Chamber Works in Deepwater, New Jersey. So now that they had green salt, the next step in making reactor fuel was to turn it into uranium metal through a process called the Ames process, which is named after the Iowa State University Ames Laboratory. But metal was also produced at DuPont Chamber Works in New Jersey, as well as Mallinckrodt and Electromet Corporation in Niagara Falls. Okay, so now they had pure uranium metal. And at this point, the US Army Corps handed the metal over to DuPont, which was the prime contractor for the plutonium project. Now, DuPont knew how to run large projects, right? They had that ability, but they didn't have the expertise on how to make reactor fuel, which, you know, is understandable because no one had made reactor fuel at this point. So they tapped Battelle Memorial Institute as consultants to help them figure out how best to turn this uranium metal into usable fuel. Now, Battelle, you know, they had some expertise, but they didn't have the equipment in order to create fuel. So they looked around and found B&T Metals, also in Columbus, Ohio. And B&T Metals had an extrusion press. They did a lot of aluminum work, like those aluminum strips on carpet edges or around sinks that you see. So they were able to figure out, working with Battelle, how to extrude this metal, uranium metal that hadn't been worked with very much, into usable rods. And eventually they figured it out, and it was time to mass produce uranium rods. And Revere Copper and Brass in Detroit, Michigan got the contract for mass producing rods through extrusion. And then Jocelyn Manufacturing Supply in Fort Wayne, Indiana, they produced rods through another method called rolling. Okay, so now they had big long rods of uranium. They needed to cut the rods into slugs. So the rods went to different machine shops, privately owned machine shops throughout the Northeast and Midwest, like here in Ohio, Herring Hall Marvin Safe Company, Baker Brothers in Toledo, C.H. Schnorr Company in Springdale, Pennsylvania, McKinney Tool and Manufacturing in Cleveland, W.E. Pratt in Joliet, Illinois, and then some went out to Hanford, the 300 area. So of course all this fuel was for reactors, including the X-10 graphite reactor in Oak Ridge, which was kind of a half-size test reactor to see if they could make the large full-size reactors out in Hanford, which went critical, the B reactor here went critical on September 26, 1944, and eventually began producing plutonium, which could be used for nuclear weapons. Now, it didn't just produce plutonium, it also irradiated bismuth, which was sent out here to Dayton so they could extract polonium for neutron initiators. And that's all I'll say about that, because I think a few of you probably know a lot more than me. But the reason it came out to Dayton was because of this man. All right. Charles Thomas. who was the executive VP and technical director at Monsanto Chemical. So he was with Monsanto, which was based out in Dayton. They didn't have enough space in their central research department, so they expanded out to the Bone Break Theological Seminary. They also wound up in the Runnymede Playhouse. And so all this polonium and plutonium, enriched uranium, was sent to Los Alamos down in New Mexico, where it went into the Gadget, which was a nuclear device, detonated at the Trinity test site in New Mexico on July 16, 1945, the world's first nuclear detonation. And being an atomic bomb, it created fallout, which the Manhattan Project scientists monitored out at Chupadera Mesa, New Mexico. Now, the enriched uranium that we kind of skipped that story, that was happening at Oak Ridge, and it went into a bomb called Little Boy, which, and the plutonium from Hanford went into a bomb called Fat Man. And on August 6, 1945, Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan. And a few days later, Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki, Japan. And these bombs created an incredible amount of death and destruction. For now, in the first time in the history of the world, a single weapon could pretty much wipe out an entire city. And they helped bring an end to World War II. Here are some folks at Oak Ridge celebrating. So at this point, the Army Corps had developed the Manhattan Project and the nuclear weapons. But with the end of the war, it was decided to hand over responsibility for atomic energy from the military to a civilian-controlled organization, the Atomic Energy Commission. All right, so what's the takeaway from part one? The race for the atomic bomb during World War II involved numerous sites across the United States. Of course, as we all know, the story doesn't end there. The Cold War and the arms race was another major reason that LM today has so many sites. All right, so during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies, particularly in the fight against Nazi Germany. However, I think it's fair to say there was some friction in the relationship. For instance, before the US got into the war, Senator Harry Truman had this to say: if we see that Germany is winning the war, we ought to help Russia. And if that Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany. And in that way, let them kill as many as possible. Although I don't want to see Hitler victorious under any circumstances. Neither of them thinks anything of their pledged word. And of course, by the end of the war, he was president. Now, Joseph Stalin, for his part, he said, "I trust no one, not even myself." And I think it's fair to say he did not trust the United States. That's why he had spies throughout the US, including George Koval, who I think you had a recent talk about. He worked down in Oak Ridge, and then he came up to the Dayton Project. I found this image of him from his FBI file that you can find online. It's kind of neat. But the espionage accelerated the Soviet Union's atomic bomb project, and on August 29, 1949, they detonated their first nuclear device, taking the US by surprise. So here's what President Harry Truman had to say. "I suppose that history will remember my term in office as the years when the Cold War began to overshadow our lives. I have had hardly a day in office that has not been dominated by this all-embracing struggle, this conflict between those who love freedom and those who would lead the world back into slavery and darkness. And always in the background, there has been the atomic bomb. So, this is pretty heavy stuff. Two ideologically opposed superpowers armed with nuclear weapons facing off against each other. And this is the world that the Atomic Energy Commission came into being in. So pretty quickly, the focus of the AEC shifted to predominantly weapons production as their main focus. So Philip Leahy, out of the Army, came back to work for the AEC back in Grand Junction, Colorado, where he set up the Colorado Raw Materials Office in order to procure domestic uranium. And you can see from this map of defense-related uranium mines that in the 50s in particular, a boom in mining spread across the US West. Here's a picture of one of the mines, the Orphan Mine, that is now in what's today the Grand Canyon National Park. And ore from the Orphan Mine was trucked up to the Tuba City Mill on the Navajo Nation, where it was processed into yellowcake. And you can see from this map of Uranium Mill Tailings Control Act sites that the West in particular, wherever there was uranium to mine, mills started popping up. Now now all this uranium that was being mined and milled fueled the expansion of the nuclear weapons complex during the Cold War. And one of the reasons the complex expanded was the consolidation of work into government-owned, contractor-operated facilities. So for example, Mound out here, which was the first facility built by the Atomic Energy Commission, and their initial contractor was Monsanto. And they consolidated that work that was happening scattered throughout Dayton into one central facility. The Feed Materials Production Center out in Fernald, Ohio, consolidated all that fuel fabrication work that had been happening in the Northeast and the Midwest. Another reason for the expansion of the weapons complex was support from privately owned sites. So for instance, the Bridgeport Brass Company in Connecticut did specialty extrusion work in support of Fernald. And then they moved their operations to Seymour, Connecticut. And then eventually they consolidated all their work in Ashtabula, Ohio. Okay, another reason for the expansion of the weapons complex was the duplication of activities. In particular, it was one way to up production, but also if the enemy or sabotage took out one of the facilities, there would be parallel facilities that could continue on the work. So for instance, Scioto Laboratory was set up as a parallel to Mound. The Savannah River site in South Carolina was set up as a parallel to the big reactors out in Hanford, Washington. So you have reactor sites on the two coasts. Portsmouth gaseous diffusion plant paralleled the work that was being done at Oak Ridge, the diffusion work. And so did the Paducah gaseous diffusion plant. And then the Weldon Spring uranium feed materials plant paralleled the work that was being done for fuel fabrication at Fernald. And then another reason for the expansion of the weapons complex was new facilities for new technologies. For instance, Pinellas down in Florida. That was set up for a new type of neutron initiator that was externally mounted, new and improved, so a new facility set up. And then, of course, the big reason for the expansion of the weapons complex was just scaling up production. So you get the Kansas City plant that did electronics and non-rad work for weapons. You got the Rocky Flats plant out in Colorado that produced plutonium pits, as well as other, I've heard it described as just one giant machine shop. And then you had to put all these parts and pieces together. So Pantex was set up down in Texas. Now, I know I've shown a lot of pictures of buildings, tons of facilities, plants, and buildings, but you know, nothing would have come of all this if it wasn't for the hard work and dedication of the men and women that worked in these buildings, the contractors like these guys at Mound Laboratory with Monsanto, or these National Lead employees at Fernald, or these Mallinckrodt employees at Weldon Spring, or these Dow Chemical employees at Rocky Flats. And I think it's fair to say that they did their job, and they did their job well. Right? If you look at the US stockpile of weapons, it shot up from just a handful at the end of World War II to a peak of over 31,000 in 1967. And with all these new weapons, they had to find somewhere to test them out, so they set up the Nevada test site. Okay, so I've talked a lot about weapons production, but the Atomic Energy Commission was interested in more than just that. They were interested in living with radiation. So they set up various tests around the country and contracted out with different groups. So they worked with the University of California, Berkeley at the Burris Park Field Station to test, to see what happens when strontium-90 gets into crop soil. They partnered with the University of California, Davis at the radiobiology laboratory to see what happens when animals were exposed to low levels of radiation over the long term. And then they worked with the Lovelace Foundation down in Albuquerque to test the effects of inhaling small amounts of radioactive material. And this wasn't hypothetical, right, at the time, living with radiation. It was a reality because of all these atmospheric tests that were occurring, particularly with the Soviet Union and the United States. Over 400 tests spreading radiation throughout the atmosphere. And that's part of the reason in 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which said that atmospheric testing was no longer allowed, and all testing from the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the US would have to happen underground. Which, you know, on the one hand, it made things better. It limited proliferation of weapons, and it limited contamination from atmospheric testing. But it created a challenge for the US in that now, in order to keep tabs on what the Soviet Union was up to, they had to figure out, you know, how do you detect these underground weapons testing? So they developed a series of experiments, kind of almost seismic tests. So they detonated underground, and you know, how can we tell what just happened? And that was called Project Vela Uniform. And they did one of these underground tests in Shoal, Nevada. They did another one out, the salmon test out in Mississippi. And then they did another one way out in Amchitka, Alaska. And then, of course, they continued doing their own weapons testing underground at the Nevada test site. But eventually, they wanted to test bigger and bigger weapons, and they kind of outgrew the Nevada test site. So they went looking for a more suitable place, and they tried a calibration test in central Nevada, and geologically it didn't prove a good spot to do a big test. So then they went back out to Amchitka and did a calibration test there, and that seemed a lot more promising. So then, in 1971, they performed the Cannikin test, which was the largest underground test that the United States ever performed, about, I want to say about 5 megatons. A little side note, protesters of this test came out in a boat and were turned back by the Coast Guard, but out of that protest evolved Greenpeace, the environmental activist group. But they weren't the only ones interested in peace. So was the US, and in particular, President Eisenhower wanted to find peaceful uses for this atomic energy. So out of his Atoms for Peace program emerged the Plowshare program. The idea here was to use nuclear blasts for civil engineering purposes, earth moving, things like that. So the first Plowshare test was down in Nome Coach, New Mexico, Project Nome. And that was a underground detonation to produce steam, to see if they could produce electricity out of it, and to see what other kind of nuclear or what other elements appeared. At Project Gas Buggy in New Mexico, they tried using a nuclear device to stimulate natural gas production, nuclear fracking, which I think from today's perspective, a lot of people can't believe this, right? You know, two things that, you know, no one, you know, everybody loves put together. But they also tried it in Project Rulison. They also tried natural gas stimulation at Rio Blanco in Colorado. One of the more ambitious Plowshare projects was Project Chariot. The idea here was to use a whole series of nuclear blasts to carve out an artificial harbor. But it ran into a lot of public outcry, a lot of pushback, not just locally, but nationally and internationally. And here's what Edward Teller had to say about it. He was a big proponent of the Plowshare program. Later on in his memoirs, he said, in retrospect, given the steadily increasing public hysteria over radiation, we should have given up without trying. And I like that quote because I think, you know, I'm with Legacy Management's communications group, and it's a reminder that, you know, you have to listen to stakeholders. You have to listen to communities. You can't just do what you want because you think it's right. Now, another application, a peaceful application of nuclear energy that was more successful was nuclear power. So the Atomic Energy Commission set up a demonstration reactor program and worked with local municipalities and local governments and other entities to create small power plants like the Bonus reactor in Puerto Rico, the Hallam reactor in Nebraska, and the Piqua reactor here in Ohio. Now, all these reactors might kind of hint at a problem that emerged. You know, people began to realize, wait a second, the Atomic Energy Commission is both promoting the nuclear industry and regulating the nuclear industry. That's kind of a conflict of interest. So the AEC in 1974 got split up into the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission to regulate, and then the Energy Research Development Administration, or ERDA, to do all the promotion and nuclear weapons work. Of course, ERDA didn't last very long because the energy crisis of 1977 in that atmosphere, it was decided to bundle together all the different federal agencies that had something to do with energy into one organization called the Department of Energy. All right, that concludes part 2. And the takeaway from that one is that the arms race in the early atomic energy programs during the Cold War involved numerous sites across the United States. Part 3, the nuclear weapons complex and the rise of environmentalism. Now, one of the things that historians are particularly interested in is change over time. And I think you see that dramatically with attitudes in the United States and the world towards the environment, particularly over the course of the 20th century. So for instance, when the Manhattan Project was up and running and in the decades afterwards, the Durango processing site that was processing all that uranium ore and uranium concentrates created enormous piles of radioactive mill tailings, and they released liquid waste right into the river. But this was kind of standard operating procedure at the time. Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project there, they didn't have a running river to use, so they dumped liquid waste from their main technical area into a dry canyon, Acid Pueblo Canyon. It kind of reminds me of, thinking of Ohio here, the Cuyahoga River, that had caught on fire maybe a dozen times from the late 19th century into the 1950s. But people just thought, that's what rivers do. They catch on fire, right? But in the 1960s, something had changed. It caught on fire again, and there was enormous public outcry. So, what caused that change? Why did people, not see something as a concern, and suddenly they are? Well, one of the reasons is all that atmospheric testing, spreading radioactive contamination throughout the atmosphere and globally. It really drove home the point that humankind had the ability to affect the environment on a planetary scale. And it started to concern some folks. One of the people it concerned was Rachel Carson, who of course wrote Silent Spring in 1962. And here's what she said in her introduction. Strontium-90, released through nuclear explosions into the air, comes to the earth in rain or drifts down as fallout, lodges in soil, enters into grass or corn or wheat grown there, and in time takes up its abode in the bones of a human being, there to remain until his death. Similarly, chemicals sprayed on croplands or forests or gardens lie long in the soil, entering into living organisms, passing from one to another in a chain of poisoning and death. This is pretty dramatic language. This is pretty much a call to arms for the environmental movement. But one thing I think it's worth noting is that to grab people's attention, to say, listen, you should pay attention to chemical pollution, she's saying, it's a lot like strontium-90 that you've heard about in the news. You're familiar with nuclear testing creating contamination. So if you're worried about that, you should be worried about chemicals too. And it did worry a lot of people, and it did create action. You can see in the 20 years after her book came out, a whole slew of environmental laws came out, including all the authorities and programs that LM operates with. So in '74, the formally utilized remedial action program started. In '76, RCRA passed. In 1978, the Surplus Facilities Management Program was set up, and that kind of grew into the D&D program that we have. In 1978, the Uranium Mills Tailing Radiation Control Act passed. And then finally, in 1980, CERCLA, or Superfund. So with all this environmental awareness, environmental activism, environmental laws coming out, the Department of Energy started to face a lot more scrutiny. And here was one of their most vocal critics. Who can name him? Yes, Senator John Glenn from Ohio. And here's what he had to say about the situation. The Department of Energy and its predecessors have been carrying out their mission to produce nuclear weapons with an attitude of neglect bordering on contempt for environmental protection. What they've said, in effect, is, we're going to build bombs and the environment be damned. Not what you want to hear about your organization. And so in that atmosphere, Admiral James Watkins was appointed Secretary of Energy. So he comes in while DOE is facing all this criticism. And here's what he had to say about the situation. There is an urgent need to effect a significant change in DOE's deeply embedded 35-year culture. It has evolved from such heavy emphasis on achieving production goals made within an atmosphere of collegial secrecy that the problems relating to safety, health, and the environment have not only been backlogged to intolerable levels, but, in effect, hidden from public view until recently. So we are now paying the price for this long-term cultural misdirection. And that's certainly something you don't want to hear your boss say, right? But it was true. DOE did pay a price. For instance, in June 1989, the FBI and EPA had a joint investigation of environmental crimes at the Rocky Flats plant. And later that month, Admiral Watkins announced that he had created a 10-point plan to strengthen environmental protection and waste management activities throughout the complex. He also created Tiger teams to assess environmental compliance at DOE's major facilities. And he announced that he had received an increased budget to accelerate cleanup. And while an increased budget's good, probably the biggest help that came his way was the end of the Cold War. So in November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall began to fall, easing tensions between the Soviet Union and the US. And on that same day, November 9, DOE established the Office of Environmental Restoration and Waste Management, which later was renamed Environmental Management, to clean up the legacy of environmental contamination. And they got to work at places like Weldon Spring and Rocky Flats in Colorado. It's jumping on me here. Fernald out here in Ohio. And of course, here at Mound. Now, it didn't take too long before various studies, workshops, reports started coming out, and people started to say, hey, wait a second, this cleanup work is great, but there's going to be a need for a long-term commitment to make sure that the remedies that were put in place are effective. Somebody's got to be there to look after it. And environmental management, EM, does great work, but they're focused on cleanup. We want to make sure DOE doesn't clean up and leave. We want to make sure that somebody is here to look after the long-term stewardship. So within that atmosphere, Assistant Secretary of EM Jesse Roberson and others decided, you know what DOE needs is another organization dedicated strictly to long-term surveillance and maintenance so they can focus on that stewardship role. So a new organization was created. Does anybody have a guess the name of that? Yes, the Office of Legacy Management. We were established, almost over 15 years ago now, in 2003. And we started off with mostly those UMTRICA, uranium mill tailing sites, all out west, but a few of the D&D reactor sites out here in the east. And then LM's responsibilities quickly grew. By 2009, you can see taking on a lot of the FUSRAP sites, expanding our portfolio greatly. And then today, we have about 94 sites spread across the country. And by 2034, we're expecting about 130 sites. So the map's getting more and more crowded. So what's the takeaway from part 3? With the emergence of new national priorities, the U.S. Department of Energy has taken on increased responsibilities for the protection of human health and the environment at many sites that played a part in the Manhattan Project and the nation's early nuclear weapons complex. So to recap, why do we have so many sites? World War II and the race for the atomic bomb, the Cold War arms race and early atomic energy programs, and finally, the emergence of human health and the environment as national priorities. And with that, my talk concludes. Thank you. Any questions?
Back to part 1, when you talked about spreading those uranium rods to all those companies, did they know how the pitfalls with that?
So back during the Manhattan Project, the companies that received either the uranium metal to fabricate into rods or to cut into slugs. It's interesting. I think there was one, Revere, where they secretly operated only on the weekends for security reasons. So the regular work staff, I don't think, was doing the work. I think, for security, they did work on the weekends. And then as far as the hazards involved, clearly there wasn't the understanding that we have today. In part, programs like EEOI, CPA have been set up to address folks that were exposed to radiation during that era.
Another question. Somewhere. Yes.
Why do you keep getting more sites? Where are those coming from?
So why do we keep getting more sites? Well, one reason is, two big reasons. DOE Office of Environmental Management keeps doing their work. As they clean up a site, it comes to us for long-term stewardship. And then with the FUSRAP program, the Army Corps of Engineers, as they keep doing their work and completing cleanup, their sites come to us for long-term stewardship.
Legacy management also has, just besides radioactivity, are the chemical element that were used in the processing, which are also an issue because so much of the machine oils and all the other things that were there and the solvents that are really carcinogens in many aspects are as hazardous to health as low levels of radioactivity or even worse. So that's all under part of your investigation too, correct?
Well, I guess
At sites that were
at sites it did rad work. Rad work is kind of, to get into our portfolio, typically, you had to do rad work. If you cross that threshold, then at sites like Mound or Rocky Flats, then...
Because they used chemicals in processing.
Yeah.
And the chemicals had their own toxicity in addition to the radioactivity. And so you had simultaneous types of contamination that was occurring. And that was industrial practice, partly out of ignorance of all of that was done, and as you indicated before, partly out of production schedules. Managers got raises and promotions for meeting production schedules. They were not necessarily for what happened to the byproducts and so forth.
I didn't say it. Secretary Watkins said it.
But a fact is a fact. All right. Any other question? Yes?
Yeah. With the effect on all the workers, is there a significant condition of the employees after like 20 years or 30 years? Now that's in the past now. Is there large cancer common among them or anything else? What has come the effect of working in the industry that's from the beginning?
You know, that's a great question. A little bit out of my field of knowledge, but I do know that there's the EEO-ICPA, Energy Employees Illness Compensation Program Act. That was passed specifically to address workers in the nuclear weapons complex, and then RICO was passed that addresses some of the folks that worked more on the mining and milling side of things.
And do you know how many people have been given an award under those programs?
That I do not know.
One of the things is this is the nuclear weapons complex, but also do you do the nuclear power industry sites that were done for processing that, or the DOD weapons like nuclear propulsion, which are reactor technology also? Now is that part of DOE legacy management too, or those sites or not?
We're primarily addressing sites that were under more direct control of either the Manhattan Project, the Atomic Energy Commission, or DOE. So rather than the private power industry, we look after those early demonstration reactors.
The military propulsion system, you know, nuclear powered aircraft, submarines, they are processed. They had
Right.
contractors that did that. Is there a comparable? Do you know if there's a comparable?
Is there a legacy management for DOD? That's a great question, and you've certainly stumped me.
Okay, well, maybe the next time. Yes.
Looks like all the sides are pretty much same parallel. Is that just a coincidence, or is there a reason why not the northern and southern parts of it?
Well, the Northeast and the Midwest, not all, but a lot of this is being driven by the FUSRAP sites because of when the Manhattan Project and early AEC started rolling. You know, they had to work fast, and they didn't have the equipment or the expertise, so they looked to these private companies. So you get, you know, in the industrial belt, where these shops already existed, you get those sites. This cluster is around St. Louis, and then which is Mallinckrodt, and then out west, all these, well, not all of them, but the majority are dealing with uranium mills. And why not the Deep South? Well, I think it has.
I mean, Savannah River is still there in South Carolina, and
Yeah.
it's an active site. I mean, they're still, although there are facilities that have been shut down,
Yeah.
but they're not necessarily under legacy management. because
Correct.
They're still active, and whether it's decontamination going on in Savannah River for sites, or at Hanford,
Yeah.
there, which is often, those are major projects still in the billions
Right.
of dollars, so they're not trivial little things.
No, major projects.
So let's thank Patrick again for coming and giving us a great overview.
Thank you.